In this video, we'll be talking about pricing. And in particular, we'll be looking at pricing from a psychological and behavioral approach. Pricing is typically viewed as one of those areas where it is most quantitative. It is very numbers oriented. In a company, typically, the finance department or even the accounting department has a stake and has a voice in determining pricing. But pricing can also be viewed from a very, behavioral or a psychological approach, a qualitative approach, as opposed to an analytical or a quantitative approach. So in this video, I want to share with you some psychological aspects of pricing that are, that are very popular, that we as consumers experience and may be vulnerable, and we fall into traps too. So with that in mind, let's take a look at pricing from a behavioral and psychological perspective. So at the end of the day, in order to profit and capture value from pricing, a company has to understand a customer's willingness to pay. So what basically this means is that customers are only going to pay for what the product or service they believe is worth, right? So with that in mind, companies have to have a good idea, whether it is through, observations, or it's through experience, or it is through surveys, market research. They have to have a good sense of how much customers are willing to pay. In other words, what is the ceiling price, that customers are willing to pay, and then price accordingly. But the problem is, customers, buyers are not going to tell you, honestly and accurately how much they're actually willing to pay. They may inflate a number, or they may deflate, and they may say one thing on a survey, but when it actually comes down to actually purchasing a product, they may, make decisions that is in direct contrast to what they said when they were participating in a survey, or what they may have told the company or to other, customers. So one of the goals of sales and marketing is to elevate the customer's willingness to pay, that truly captures and reflects the product's true value. So a product in the minds of the company will have a true value, what they think is truly valuable in the market. This is from the company's perspective. But as I said before, that true value may not coincide with what the customer's perceived value is. Typically, the perceived value from the customer's perspective will be lower than the company's assessment of what they think their true value is worth. So, so that means that marketing or sales need to, examine and do whatever they can through market research to elevate and raise customers' willingness to pay that truly reflects the product's true value. But you can only do that if you increase the perceived value that customers feel. So if you increase the perceived value that the customers sense, and you make it closer, that approaches the product's true value, then it'll be easier to raise customers' willingness to price. So eventually, as the perceived value gets raised, the customer's willingness to pay will also increase. That reflects that perceived value, and therefore the company will be able to charge a higher price. So because buyers are, like I said before, they're rarely truthful, and we don't want to price our products based on what they simply say. We need to take a deeper look, a deeper, investigation into the pricing decision-making process. And typically, in order to look at this black box, what goes inside the minds of customers, this is where psychology can play a big role and contribute. Because, taking an analytical perspective is one thing, but understanding the fact that customers are irrational, they're not always rational, and they're bounded rationality decision makers. Taking into these limitations of how consumers, or for that matter, human beings make decisions, incorporating a psychological, perspective into understanding how consumers make pricing decisions can, make a significant contribution. So, just as we have to understand our cost to market, companies must understand, the minds of customers and how customers arrive at pricing decisions. Having said that, there are 6 different pricing effects that we will look at in this video. And these 6 different pricing effects reflect a psychological aspect to pricing. So they are in the order of decoy effects. Another word for decoy effects is the asymmetric dominance effect. And we're going to go, we're going to look at each of these with some examples. So it'll be a lot clearer as we go on. The second is a reference price effect, difficulty comparison effect, switching cost effect, end benefit effect, and payment effect. So these are the 6 pricing effects that are influenced by, by consumer psychology, from a psychological aspect. So let's take a look at the first one, which is a decoy effect, or the asymmetric dominance effect. So imagine this scenario. So we have here in this slide, we have 2, popcorns, different sizes, small and large. So, imagine that you're at a theater, trying to watch a movie, and, you want to get some popcorn before the movie starts. You go to the concession stand, and, there's 2, sizes of popcorn, small and large. The small is priced at $3. The large is priced at $7. So obviously in this video, in this scenario, depending on how much you like popcorn or how much you want to spend or how much you want to consume, some people will purchase the small size popcorn, others will purchase the large size popcorn. But imagine the next scenario where now, in addition to the small and large, we add a medium, because this is typically, if you go to any concession stand, they have 3 different sizes, small, medium, and large. But the thing here is that the medium is priced at $6.50. In other words, it's priced closer to the large size popcorn, which is at $7, than it is to the small size popcorn, which is priced at $3. Now, how is this going to influence people's decision-making in terms of how they view price? So in our previous video, in our previous slide, when we just had 2 sizes, small and large, some people may have had, like I said before, preference for small or preference for large. However, when we include a medium priced at $6.50, this all of a sudden kind of changes our consumers' preferences. It's probably going to make consumers prefer the large size as opposed to the small size. In other words, even for those that may have preferred the small in the previous slide, they may gravitate now towards purchasing the large size. Why? Because if you just pay 50 cents more, you can probably buy, you can get a large size. So the point of this, because it's a decoy, right? It's an asymmetric dominance effect because they're asymmetrical. Because if you changed the price of this medium from $6.50 to, let's say, $3.50 or $4 instead of the $6.50, then all of a sudden, again, the people's preferences may change more towards the small size popcorn priced at $3. So the bottom line here is that people's preferences are they're unstable, and they're not fixed. They can fluctuate depending on what alternative options are given to customers priced at different levels. So, in other words, managers have under their control the freedom and the flexibility to price different options that may change people's, purchase decisions, one way or the other. Let's look at another example. So this example, we have 3 examples here which are related. So in example 1, we have brand 1 and brand 2. So you imagine these as, let's say, printers, right? So brand 1 is priced at $400. The warranty is 3 years. Brand 2 is priced at $300, and the warranty is 2 years. So these are printers. Now, let's move on to example 2. Now, if you look at example 1 versus example 2, in example 2, we've included brand 3, a third printer, which is priced at $450, and has a warranty of 2.5 years. Now, by including this brand 3, now, as you can see, all of a sudden, brand 1 becomes a lot more attractive than brand 2. Why? Because it's priced lower and it has a longer warranty of 6 months longer, half a year longer. So just assume that it was 50-50 in example 1. The preference, let's say, for sake of illustration, it was 50-50 between brands 1 and 2. Now that 50-50 is not going to stay the same 50-50 by including brand 3 in example 2. Most likely people are going to, have a higher preference towards brand 1. Brand 1 is all of a sudden going to seem a lot more attractive than brand 2 because of brand 3, because of the inclusion of brand 3. Now let's move on to example 3. If you look at example 3, again, we include a third brand. However, now it's priced at $350 and the warranty is 1.5 years. So now all of a sudden, if you compare example 1 versus example 3, now brand 2 will become more attractive as opposed to brand 1. And probably the 50-50 between the two brands that we assumed in example 1 may shift from 50-50 to 40-60 or 30-70 towards in preference over for brand 2 in example 3. Why? Because brand 3 is priced lower and has a longer warranty as opposed to brand 3. So just like we saw with the popcorn example, here by including the third brand, brand 3, in addition to brand 1 and 2, and how we price that, along with some other features of the printer, in which case this was the warranty, that's going to change and shift people's preferences between the two brands 1 and 2, depending on how we price the third brand. So again, this goes to show you that brand 3 can be used as a decoy to either increase the sales of brand 1 or the sales of brand 2. So depending on what the goal of the company is, if you want to increase your sale of brand 1, then you would price your brand 3 as an example 2. If you want to increase your sales of brand 2, for whatever reason it may be, then you would price your brand 3 according to example 3, and that will get the job done. Let's move on to the reference price effect. The reference price effect basically means that a reference means sort of a price, a standard price, a price that customers can compare against, right? Whether that reference price can be a competitor price, or it could be the same price of a brand, the same brand price that they charged in the past and what they charge now. But basically, the reference price means that you're comparing the current price to some reference, to some standard, and you're using that to judge how sensitive people may be to the current price. So the reference price rule suggests that buyers are more sensitive to price the higher the product's price is relative to the prices of the buyer's substitutes. Right? So if the current price is higher than the reference price, then people are going to be more sensitive. So some examples are, it was, let's say in the past, $9.99, now it's $7.99, or the competitor's price is $9.99, whereas ours is $7.99. So the was 99 or the there's 99 is the reference price. That's what people are comparing it against. And the higher our prices, in which case it's $7.99, the more sensitive people are going to be. If it was $5.99, then they'd be, a lot less sensitive. So what this means is that the order of presentation influences a customer's reference price, right? So the order in which customers view or see, if you have multiple products that customers are going to see, then the sequence, right? The sequence or the order in which the customers see these prices will have an effect, will subconsciously form a reference price in the minds of customers. So research shows that when prices are listed in descending order, so what we mean by descending is from highest to lowest, right? From highest to lowest, people form higher reference prices than those that saw them in ascending order from low to high, right? That has to be the case. Why? Because the price that they see first typically will stick in their minds, and that will be the price that customers compare against, right? So the price that they see earlier on, if there's a sequence, that will be the reference price against which people are going to judge the subsequent prices against. We see this in hotels. We see this in, when you go to a restaurant, menus. So in terms of menus, next time you go to a restaurant, look at the menus, right? Some, restaurants will have the highest priced menu, the dish. If you look at an entree at the top, and then as you go down, it'll become lower. That's like descending order. Or you could have it the other way, right? You can have it in ascending order where you'll see the cheapest, the lowest price first, and then the highest price last. So as you will see, as I will explain a little bit later, this has significant implications on how customers arrive at their decision making for the products that they see, if they see things in order. So this has implications for merchandising, right? Display, in channels, in grocery stores, and how products are displayed on the shelf. So you want to put private label brands close to premium brands. Why? Because then the premium brands will serve as a reference point. And that's assuming that you want to increase the sales of your private label brands. So if you're like Costco, or if you're like, Walmart, they have their own private label brands, like Kirkland, right? Then if you want to increase your generic brands or private label brands, then it may be a good idea to place them very close to, adjacent to the premium brands. Why? Because the premium brands can serve as a reference price, and the private label brands will be perceived as a lot more affordable. It'll be a lot reasonably priced, a lot cheaper, and that may increase your sales. So implication for industries where you can go top down selling, cars, real estate. There could be endless examples, but for cars, show the most expensive BMW first, or in real estate, show the most expensive property first, because then that's going to serve, all of these examples serve the one that the ones that people see initially will serve as the reference price, and everything else will be typically compared against that reference price. So this has implications for new product pricing. There's a debate on how to price new products when companies are trying to launch new products in the market. Do you price them low in the beginning, or should you price them high in the beginning? Some marketers argue that new products should be priced low, to motivate customers to try the product, and to build momentum, and to get some good traction, eventually leading to higher market share. However, there can be an issue here, right? There can be, based on what we said about the reference price, if the low initial price, because you've charged it lower, lowers the buyer's reference price, which it will, then this may adversely affect sales later down in the road, if they want to raise the price, right? Because then the low initial price will be seen as the reference price, and if they want to raise the price later on for whatever reason it may be, then there may be some backlash and resistance. Many studies have shown that a seller should first establish the price, the product's regular price, which is like is in a descending order. So you price it at the regular price, and then if you do want to provide a discount, promote the discount as a temporary price cut. So then again, because the temporary price cut will be perceived a lot lower. Why? Because you're comparing it against the regular price that they initially established. If you don't do that, the low reference price may undermine the product's perceived value later on, which could impact your sales in a negative fashion. So, again, this is a debate. There's no, yes or no, right or, wrong answer, but these are things that, you should contemplate and think through, in terms of whether we should price our product when we're first launching it in the market, and we haven't done it in the past, at a fairly low price that truly reflects the perceived value, or do we want to, price it lower because we want to build momentum and we want to build that fast market share? Okay. In relation to this, I want to talk briefly about there's a concept called option framing effect. And basically what this means is that we can frame, right? We can frame, an option here meaning a product, in two different ways. And depending on how we frame and present the same product in two different ways, that can have a very significant impact on the the number of attributes that customers may end up choosing, or the perceived value that they may feel that they're getting from purchasing the product. So let me explain this in greater detail. So the two option framing choices that consumers can be confronted with are what we call, the first one is called subtractive option framing. We call that OF minus. And then the other one is called additive option framing, OF plus. So I'm going to explain this. Let's use a car example. So a car can have, there's a base model, and there could be a safety package, a performance package, a luxury package, a winter package. Nowadays, there's tech packages, and so forth. So we have the base model, which every car has, and then there's different packages that you can add on, right? So let's assume that we start out with the full model. The full model meaning everything included, the base model plus all the packages that, you can think of, right? So then we ask, consumers, okay, delete the packages that you don't need or you don't want, right? But you're starting out with the full model. So that would be an example of a subtractive option framing. The additive option framing can be thought of as, okay, let's start out with the base model now instead. This is the bare minimum, the base model. But depending on what your needs are, you can add the different packages that we see in the subtractive option framing, the safety package, performance, luxury, winter, tech packages, right? So if you think about it, if consumers know what their preferences are, the number of packages that consumers end up choosing at the end of the day should not differ depending on which option framing that they're confronted with. So whether we show consumers the subtractive option framing or the additive option framing, the number of packages chosen, let's say, if I just want safety and performance, I know that's what I want, then they should choose those two regardless of whether they see a subtractive option framing or an additive option framing. But research shows that, and empirical data shows that is not necessarily the case. Consumers end up choosing more packages or features of a product or a service or attributes when they see a subtractive option framing as opposed to an additive option framing. So another example that I think we all can relate to is the simple example of pizza, right? We all like pizza. So you can start out with a full pizza. What do you call it? With all the toppings included, right? So you got pepperoni, green pepper, mushroom, and let's say if there are 10 toppings, start with the most complex, the most fully loaded pizza, and then subtract the toppings that you don't want. That would be an example of subtractive option framing. The additive option framing would be start out with just cheese and then add the toppings that you do want. Well, if you know what toppings you want, then you should end up with the same number of toppings, regardless of whether you saw the subtractive option framing or the additive option framing. But again, research shows that people end up choosing more toppings when they view the pizza in a subtractive option framing. And this basically gets to the fact that, in the subtractive option framing, there's a trade-off, right? You're losing utility. Why? Because you're deleting the packages. So that's utility loss. But you're saving money. But why? Because you're subtracting the packages. So that's a monetary gain. That's a trade-off that you have to make in the subtractive option framing. In the additive option framing, the trade-off is you're adding packages. So there's a gain in utility, whereas you are spending more money by adding those packages. Therefore, there's a loss in money. There's a monetary loss. So that's the trade-off. So these are two different trade-offs depending on the frame of the two framings. And what people have shown is that if you compare the utility loss versus the monetary loss, customers, human beings are more, they're more sensitive to utility loss than they are to monetary loss. And that's why, so the losses, they're not the same, right? Depending on whether it's utility loss or monetary loss, people are more sensitive to utility loss, and therefore they end up choosing more attributes or toppings in the case of pizza or packages in the case of cars. So what's the conclusion? Consumers in the OF minus, this is attractive option framing, will be more averse to deleting options, which is the utility loss, than those engaged in OF plus will be to adding them, which leads to economic loss. Therefore, consumers are likely to choose more options, more toppings, more features of a product under the OF minus than under the OF plus. So this is what research has shown, that this is just a slide that shows this in graphical form, that the number of options chosen is greater for the OF minus than it is for the OF plus. So that's the conclusion in terms of the number of options chosen. Now, there is also a difference in the perceived value that customers feel between these two framings. So compared with consumers in the OF plus condition, in the OF plus framing, those in the OF minus framing perceive more value from their final choice. So why would that be? So in order for people to perceive more value, they have to feel that they're getting more benefits, they're getting more features or attributes at a lower cost. So if we go back a few slides, recall that we said that we just said that in the OF minus, people end up choosing more features or options in the OF minus than the OF plus. But in the OF minus, the reference price is the highest price. Why? Because we start out with the fully loaded option. And then as you delete the packages, the options, the price is going to get lower. So therefore, it seems as if you're getting a better deal. Why? Because compared to the highest price, you're saving money. Whereas in the OF plus, you start out with the lowest price, which is the base model in our car example. And then as you add the packages, that's going to increase the price. So the reference price in that example is the base model price, which is the lowest price possible. And because you add packages, you're going to end up at a higher price, which makes people feel that, oh, compared to the reference price, I ended up paying a lot more. So therefore, if you compare the price and the number of features or the options that people end up choosing, people just perceive that they're getting a better value in the OF minus framing as opposed to the OF plus. And this, again, this graphic representation confirms what we just discussed. Okay, the next pricing effect is what we call the difficulty or the easy comparison effect. And this basically means that when consumers have a hard time making comparisons in terms of price between alternatives, between options, then people get more, it becomes less sensitive when it's more difficult to compare. Whereas when it's easy to compare, then people become more price sensitive. So in other words, buyers are less sensitive to price, the more difficult the comparison is relative to the prices of the buyer's substitutes. So imagine this, when it's easy to compare prices across different brands, then that's going to make price more salient, top of the mind, and therefore people just become more sensitive, Whereas when it's difficult to make price comparisons, then people, because they can't easily compare, price of brand A to price of brand B to C, D, and so forth, they're going to be less price sensitive and they're going to focus on other features or benefits, right? So look at this example. This is Tide, right? So now Tide, they, for laundry detergent, they, sell many different, formats or different, they sell powder Tide, They sell pods. They sell liquid and so forth. And sometimes, we have a hard time, deciding which one we should buy, although there can be a preference for certain, types. But if you, which a lot of actually, if you make the price comparison very easy by comparing, the price per load, then, people become more sensitive to price, right? Because here, as you can see, they all have different prices depending on the load per load. So then price becomes salient, and that could attract, consumers that are trying to determine which one to buy to just narrowly focus on price information and make the decision based on price. Another example is a lot of the websites nowadays, their model is providing price information, like Kayak or Trivago for hotels. People go to these websites to compare prices easily, because they'll have all the different hotels or all the different brands of airfares or rental cars or whatever it may be on a single page, and it makes the price comparison very easy to do without much effort, and that sensitizes people's information to price. Switching cost effect. The next is the switching cost effect, and what this basically means is that when people have a hard time switching, in other words, they have to, it's mental labor, it's new learning, it's monetary cost. So in other words, when they're forced to pay some either tangible or intangible costs from switching from brand A to brand B, then people become less price sensitive. Right? So the higher the switching cost, the less price sensitive people are going to be. Whereas the opposite is true, right? The lower the switching cost, the easier it is to switch, then people are going to be more price sensitive. So the switching cost rule says that buyers are less sensitive to the price of a product or a service the greater the switching cost is, right? So some examples would be a new office software package that requires expensive new training. So an IT manager, let's say, has two choices, right? $8 million for a new package, or $1.5 million added cost to the current program that already costs $7 million. So one is $8 million, the other is $8.5. Now, just from a financial perspective, one is $500,000 more than the other, right? But these are things that are difficult to switch. They take a lot of time. There's administrative cost. There can be resistance from the employees and so forth. So when the switching cost is high, people are going to be less price sensitive. Another example could be the child care provider whose costs go up. Again, for parents that have gone through this, you probably know, right? So when you put your child in a daycare or child care provider, the child over time, makes friends, connects to, the provider, the environment, is just more psychologically, more comfortable. And so that means that if you want to switch providers because they raise the price, then the switching cost is going to be very, very high, not only for the parent, but also more importantly for the kid. Therefore, they're just going to suck it up. The parents are going to suck it up and say, okay, I know that it's going to cost a little bit more, but, they're going to be less sensitive because the switching cost, is very high. The end benefit effect. So what is this? So basically this means that when you're paying for a larger item that costs a lot, and there is a component or a part or element of this larger service or a product, then people are less price sensitive to that part or component, which is part of that larger product or service, right? So how much was the cost of the radial tires on your Porsche? If you're spending, I don't know how much a Porsche would cost, but, $60,000, $70,000, are you going to, be price sensitive and say, oh, I'm not going to put these, nice looking tires on when you've paid $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 on a Porsche? Most people will say no. So when the bigger product is a big chunk that you're spending, and there's a component there people are less sensitive to that smaller, element or component price because you've already paid that larger, that significantly higher price for that, entire, that larger, product. How much did the open bar cost at the wedding? If you're paying, tens of thousands of dollars for a wedding ceremony, then, having an open bar, even if it costs, a certain amount, that may, not seem that much. Why? Because if I'm paying that much already for a wedding, this may not be on the top of the mind awareness, and, you're not going to be sensitized to that. So people may not, be very sensitive to the cost of the open bar. So in other words, buyers are less price sensitive when the product or the service or an element of that is part of an overall largest purchase or benefit. So another example is J&J Johnson and Johnson priced the drug-coated coronary stent at $3,500, which may seem a lot, which may not, depend on how you view it. I guess it's 250% above the competition. And the reason why they were able to do that and there was less resistance is because it negated further complications or procedures that may cost $30,000 or more. So if you're paying $30,000 or more, then that $3,500 may not seem that much, and people are kind of like desensitized to that. Why? Because there's a larger chunk, a larger purchase that that sucks them into and that makes them focus on that larger purchase as opposed to the smaller amount that's part of that larger purchase. So again, in this example, I think most of us know this Nespresso, where these pods. So if you're paying, $200-$300 for these machines, or it could run up to $400 or $500, but they sell pods, and that's how they make money, right? So you pay $400 or $500 for this machine, and I'm not going to nickel and dime over pods. Why? Because pods, although they can add up, initially, I've spent a larger chunk on this machine. Therefore, they're not as sensitive to price on the smaller part, which is the pod. But as we know, companies that's how they make money, by selling the pods, right? Because people are not sensitive, and in order to use this machine, they have to keep ordering the pods. It's kind of like the printer and the cartridge example, right? And a lot of HP, and these companies, Dell, they make money not selling printers per se, but on the cartridges that they sell. Okay, let's look at the payment effect. So this is the last pricing effect, and the payment effect has two parts. It describes a situation where consumers either pay by cash, or they can pay by check. They can pay by credit card, or nowadays they can even, for some services or products, they can pay through automatic withdrawal, right, from their account, automatic withdrawal, and this has an effect. I think we all can kind of relate to that. People are more sensitive depending on the medium, right? The medium, the method that we use to pay for the same product or service. Typically, people are more sensitive. They're most sensitive when we pay by cash. And people are least sensitive when it's automatic withdrawal from our account. Sometimes we don't even realize that it's going on. And then the second, least sensitive would be when we pay by credit cards. That's why people get in, credit card debt, right? Because they're just desensitized, right? I mean, just swiping a plastic, magnetic stripe, and it really doesn't feel painful, right? Whereas if you're taking, if you're paying for $100, you're taking $20 bills out of your wallet, and you're counting 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, that feels a lot more painful that I'm paying, a significant amount, as opposed to, swiping your card and just, providing your autograph. So that's one part of the payment effect. The other is, it also says that, there's a difference in people on how much people are sensitive depending on whether you're paying, an all-inclusive, like a bundle, right? A bundle would be a great example of an all-inclusive package, or when it's an a la carte, individual parts in that bundle, right? So when people are paying all inclusive as a bundle, they're less sensitive. When people are paying a la carte or paying individual elements, parts of it, then that makes them a lot more price sensitive. So the payment effect rule says that consumers are much more price sensitive when they pay in cash as opposed to the other payment method that I just explained. And also consumers are much more price sensitive when they pay via a la carte as opposed to a bundle or an all-inclusive package. Right? So, some examples here, like, we've heard this, we're probably all, fall victim to this. If you talk to any financial advisor, they say, try to restrict your credit card usage as much as possible. Don't make 4 or 5 credit cards, and try to have a goal and stick to that in terms of how much your monthly credit card payment is going to be, or else we kind of like lose track of it. And at the end of the month, when we receive our statement, it's way more than what you had planned for, or you can actually pay for what you spent. And then restaurants bundle foods in a fixed price meal, right, as opposed to a la carte. So that makes customers a lot less price sensitive. Or if you go to a football stadium or any sports stadium, they have these all-you-can-eat for $40 sections. So then that makes people less price sensitive as well. So that that increases the sales, right, of these seats, because they think that they're getting a very good deal, because it makes them less price sensitive.